Hey, welcome to the 97th episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Dr. Nathan Baumann. Dr. Baumann is a licensed clinical psychologist in Colorado. He has advanced specialization in integrated healthcare, health psychology, sleep disorders, substance abuse, and sports psychology. His research efforts have focused on health behavior changes over the lifespan and has advanced training in the interplay between physical health, mental health, and environmental factors. Welcome, Nate.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Great. So, how I love to begin the podcast is for you just to share a little bit about your journey. How did you get into the work you're now doing?
Uh, I think that starts actually pretty young. So I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, in Minnesota. Um, Rural, but um, a lot of mental health challenges for a lot of people in the town where I grew up. There weren't a ton of resources, but there also just wasn't a lot of attention being paid to like children's mental health, like how people were actually doing. Um, and I can remember one specific incident when I was probably in seventh or eighth grade, junior high, 13-ish years old. I was talking to um, a girl on the phone, and she was, again, from an even more rural community than I was. And she was telling me about her suicidal thoughts and, um, her imminent self-harm action. This was I had no idea what I was doing. I had no clue how to talk to somebody who was in that kind of state. But it stayed with me um, kind of for the rest of my life. Obviously, I still think about that interaction with her. But it also sort of just drove home this idea that she really just kind of wanted to feel like a person, like a human. She wanted somebody to listen to her and feel like life was gonna be okay and keep going. So that actually tended to happen to me a lot moving forward. People felt comfortable coming to me with stuff. I was um, a safe place for some people. And I also myself kind of felt like an outcast at times. So a little bit more background was that I was an athlete growing up. I spent a lot of time playing sports. I was in three different sports, very, very American, like football, baseball, basketball, sports. And my life tended to revolve around those things. And I spent a lot of time with guys, with boys. Um, every weekend, every practice, every extra amount of time I was kind of spending with boys all throughout childhood and into high school. I happen to have, a little bit of athletic ability. So in a small town, I got a lot of sports attention. I was on all the, you know, um, varsity teams. I don't know how well that translates to the UK, but um, the older teams as a youngin.
Mhm.
And again, in the US, we kind of pedestalize athletes a little bit. We have that reputation. So I thought going into that experience, maybe when I was 14 or 15 years old, that I would then also um, be liked, that people would embrace me and want me around and value me because of all the sports that I was playing. And I was wrong about that. That was a kind of a rude awakening as I kept going through high school because along with all of that emphasis on sport, I was very rigid. I wouldn't drink. I wouldn't have sex in high school. I wouldn't really break any rules. I was very much, a golden child and wouldn't dare kind of break rules. And when I did break rules, it was very painful. Like I had to be talked into it. And um, that didn't go over super well with my peers. They weren't they weren't really super excited to hang out with somebody who wouldn't break any rules, wouldn't party with them, wouldn't entertain some of the riskier things that they were doing. And at the time, I was confused about why that was a problem. Looking back, I certainly understand it a lot better now, but at the time it felt very lonely. Um, Very lonely, and I went through some pretty intense depression throughout high school, from like kind of the moment it started to the moment it ended. And I always kind of thought um, I would resist getting into mental health because I was always very analytic and I was always trying to read people, but I didn't want that to be how I viewed the world. I didn't want to learn how to be a therapist and then constantly be analyzing people and you know, approaching everything as a treatment. Um, but when I was sitting in the training room my senior year, I spent a lot of time in the training room because I got hurt a lot. So the I got to know the trainer very well, and she goes, with unprompted, essentially goes, "So are you going to major in psychology when you go to college?" And I remember distinctly saying, "No, I am not going to. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm certainly not going to do that." So I was undeclared. I ended up playing baseball in college here. I was undeclared as a major for a couple of years. And I know, like, it just, when I started taking the psychology classes, they were like a second language to me. I understood it very well. I felt at home, and I didn't have to work really hard to understand the concepts because they felt kind of intuitive. Um, I double majored in English in writing, so um, I was busy as an athlete and a double major and graduating in 4 years, but um, it showed me that that was something that I could do and should do. I then, I was pretty good at baseball in college, so I ended up playing in the minor leagues for a couple of years here and had the opportunity to continue playing. But after my second year in the minor leagues, I was tired of it. It's not a glorious life. It's really kind of an awful life. Um, I left baseball to go to graduate school, and I was behind. I was very behind heading into graduate school because I had spent so much time and energy on baseball. So it took me some years to catch up academically. I don't know that I ever really did catch up to my to my peers in my PhD program academically, but it was quite a stark. I mean, getting back to this idea of masculinity and learning about what it means to have a perception of your masculinity. I moved from sports teams in the U.S. up until I was 22 or 23 to when I went to my master's program, I was the only um, man in a cohort of 18. So I went from a team of 26 men to a team of 18 women, which was a stark change. And that was actually the time when I learned a lot about a whole bunch of aspects of my identity, but certainly masculinity. So um, I think it's been since then, I've spent a lot of work on myself thinking about masculinity as opposed to like my research and stuff like that. But there's been a lot of opportunities for me to think more critically about how I show up in relationships and how men have or have not showed up in relationships with me. And um, that kind of brings us to where we are today, right? Like thinking more about what I want my life to look like. And I get to learn a lot about how emotions and stuff like that work because of my job. So it's been great to have a little bit of perspective and be able to do that work myself too.
Thank you, Nate. What a fascinating story. I can't remember what I've been watching, but I've been watching some show about the minor leagues, and I have heard how tough it is. So, I can't remember. I think it was a major league baseball player who goes down to the minor leagues and going from basically very few crowds and
Hmm.
late nights and traveling all the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm. I can tell a story to illustrate just what kind of pushed me over the edge. So I played my second season in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is smack dab kind of in the middle of the continent. And we had to do a road trip down to three cities in Texas. So we drove from Sioux Falls, South Dakota to Amarillo, which was, it might have been something like a 17-hour bus trip. We drove through the night. So it was a long time on a bus. We played three games in Amarillo, which is this, again, a rural kind of dusty town in Texas. And then we drove from Amarillo to Laredo, which was a 12-hour drive. And then we drove from Laredo to El Paso, which was a 9-hour drive. And so we spent a week in Texas, and then we drove the 20 hours back to Sioux Falls. And on that road trip, we played 10 games, and I think I got 2 hits in those 10 games. So it's not only is it this very sort of arduous task to try to stay focused throughout that time, it's also baseball is just a brutal sport. When it's not going well, it is really tough on your mentality. So that was kind of the road trip where I was like, is this worth the $500 a month I'm getting paid? Probably not. I'm gonna probably move on. So yeah, it was a great experience, but it was not glorious in the least.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. I think sometimes I've always perceived, oh, sportsmen are very, yeah, no, it's glamorous. And yeah, I think I've understood as I've got older that, oh no, actually, maybe the league, yes, but everything else is very arduous. So,
Yeah, for sure.
so I guess the first question really I want to talk about, boys will be boys, behavior of young boys. I'd love you to talk a bit about your thoughts around that, about, what's happening at the moment. What are you seeing?
I hear a lot of um, I just hear a lot of people talking about the differences between boys and girls as children. And some of it might very well be true. The way that, you know, the two genders express their energy or use their energy might be different. Their hormones might be different, and that might affect some of the ways they behave. But I just don't think we give as much space to girls when it comes to their quote unquote bad behavior. We don't say, oh, girls will be girls, they'll hurt people. I just think we have so much space for boys to hurt each other and to hurt people. And of course, I think that applies to young children. So we start kind of thinking about boys in those terms from the time they're born, but throughout their childhood, all of a sudden when they start interacting with other children in grade school, first grades through seventh grade. Yeah, sure. I think that there's a lot of things that boys do where we're like, yeah, they're just a lot of energies. They hit each other, they wrestle, they do things that are physical and violent. And I think that in and of itself is pretty damaging. To constantly be funneling a boy's behavior through this low expectation we have of their ability to manage emotions. I think that starts really, really young. And I don't think it's really fair either. I think that sets boys especially up for this um, kind of lack of direction when it comes to, like, so let's say that is true. Let's say boys do externalize a little bit more naturally, which you'd have to work hard to prove that to me, but let's take that at face value. Um, Instead of chalking up some of their behavior to like the fact that their gender is geared toward boyness, what if we taught them differently or challenged it or gave them some new tools or took their externalized and emotional displays in good faith and processed what they were feeling even after they did something that could be construed as boys will be boys. So I don't know that we, as men in particular, I don't know that we're socialized to do that, especially as fathers. I don't know that dads are given a lot of tools to sit down with their son and be like, "Hey, I know that overcame you, or I know that that was a hard situation for you, and I'm not mad at you. I'm not going to try to power and control my way into you behaving by punishing you or threatening you. I need you to tell me what you were feeling. Let's practice using some words. And if you can't find your words right now, let's work on it." Um, I certainly that certainly was not how I was raised. And like I said, a lot of this stuff I think is anecdotal from the men that I've grown up with and the men that I've been around. I've been around obviously a lot of men throughout that trajectory through sports, and that I spent a lot of time around boys who were boys, you know, and that I think is one section of that I find relatively problematic. That as men we're not able to find a space to hold boys to a higher bar.
Mhm.
my hypothesis is that we also don't want to shed too much light on the low bar that we were held to either as as children, or indict any of our parents or anything like that. So I think there are lots of reasons why that happens, but the place where I think it is as damaging, if not more so, particularly for women, is when we start to apply boys will be boys to sexual behavior in power and control in sex relationships. And we talk about um, sex for boys as though it's this time bomb going off, and that it is, almost impossible to control, and that it is this unyielding force in puberty for boys. And I think, again, when we talk about the sexuality of boys as they're learning about sex, from the time that they're starting to have those feelings and going through sex ed, um, boys will be boys doesn't have a lot of space for consent. There's not a lot of teaching there about what it means to get consent and really good consent.
Mhm.
There's not, I mean, consent is consent. There's no such thing as good consent. So I think when we have all of this space for the damage that boys can do, not only to each other, because there's a ton of damage that boys do to each other, but also this lack of emphasis on how boys can just participate more effectively as they're learning about themselves,
Mhm.
right? So if we were to find places to focus some effort on um, removing um, some of those barriers for boys to grow, treating them as though they can handle talking about consent when they're young is a great way to start, right? Like you're going to have maybe some new sex feelings, which is great. Your body's going to start changing. Awesome. The girls around you, their bodies are going to start changing as well. And let's learn how to relate. Let's learn how to especially talk about sex in a different way where it's not conquering, where it's not, some kind of validation for your ego or something like that. Let's talk about it in terms of, a pleasure activity that's supposed to be consensually pleasurable, and kind of talk about it in more realistic terms as opposed to where I grew up, it was kind of veiled in this purity kind of like virginity culture. And then I just knew a whole bunch of boys who were kind of flying by the seat of their pants, learning about sex through porn and through
Mhm.
their experiences with women who also didn't really have a good grasp on what consent meant because they were raised in the patriarchy as well. So
Mhm.
I think there's just a lot of areas where we start very young, viewing boys' behavior through a certain lens of again power and control, but even being out of control,
Mhm.
right? And then that kind of just continues throughout their life, and without being able to view their behavior through some kind of accountability lens, right? Not a shame, right? They don't have to feel ashamed of what they're doing. They don't have to feel wrong for what they're doing, but we can talk to them about effectiveness, social effectiveness. We can talk about their effect they have on other people around them. We can talk about the space that we have for their mistakes and their shortcomings, and ways that they can start to integrate the actual feedback they're getting from those mistakes and shortcomings, as opposed to integrating them in a way that makes them just feel wrong or bad or damaged.
Mhm.
And I think that's the other thing that boys will be boys kind of does for them is if we're only if a boy does something that we view as toxic or wrong or hurtful, and then we just chalk that up to the very thing that they are as a boy, that
Mhm.
doesn't give you much hope for learning something different either. It just is it is so shackling to this idea that somehow boyness is bad or some excuse to be bad or something like that. So that's when I say that boys will be boys is damaging for men in general. I think it starts so young, and then it's really hard, I think, to let go of that, socially, when we always view the behavior of boys through this lens that like, oh, they're just always gonna kind of hurt people.
Mhm.
Um, that really is that shrinks their ability a lot.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you,
Mhm.
Nate. Yeah, I love what you said about the accountability lens. I think
Mhm.
that's for me, benevolent masculinity is to be accountable, right? So this is what I'm going to do. Have I done it? And then holding myself or having others hold me to account. And yeah, and I love what you mentioned as well, you know, something to do with the tools, gaining new tools. I mean, for you, what are some of these tools that we can teach these boys?
So I think in all of that, one of the things that really gets left behind is being able to notice and process and do something with our emotions.
Mm, mm,
And I think this happens not just for boys, but again, we're talking about them in particular, where when when we get to funnel everything through anger,
mm,
and we get to funnel everything through something like frustration. Whenever I ask men how they feel, those are the two things they'll say. I'm angry and I'm frustrated. And frustration can be an interesting emotion, but it's also just it's kind of distant from emotion, right? Um, it's this one that feels descriptive, but it's not very deep. I'm frustrated, right? Like, what is it that you're frustrated about? Why would that thing frustrate you? And I use traffic as an example a lot because it's a low stakes but very poignant example of how we manage emotions. So people with we use the term road rage, but who just get angry or frustrated or panicked in traffic situations. Why is that? I mean, have you ever experienced that, like the road rage kind of traffic madness that comes with us?
I haven't personally felt it,
Yeah,
um, but I've heard about it and I've seen it a
yeah.
lot. Well, I haven't seen it that much, but I've
Uh,
heard lots of people get angry.
And there's this component of anger, I think, that has a lot to do with control. So especially when we are externalizing anger, when I'm angry at something and I'm going to show you that I'm angry in order to get you to kind of stop whatever it is that you're doing, or so I can send you a message about what you're doing, has a lot to do with whether or not we feel in control of the situation. And traffic is such a great example of feeling out of control,
Mm,
and feeling like I want to find a way to get control. So if we get cut off, or if somebody's not going at the rate of speed that we hoped they would go, or if somebody's trying to get into a lane that we're driving at, that's always the one that's the most fascinating to me. We're all using the same road that was put here for us all to use, and you happen to be in a lane of one of those roads, and yet when somebody wants to get in front of or behind you on a certain lane, somehow that's an infringement on our uh, driving. I don't know. Some of the rules that we've set up, at least in the U.S., about how to drive and when to get upset with people and on how they're driving is very interesting because it does all sort of revolve around this idea that I can't control what the other person's doing, right? So maybe if they cut me off, I'll flip them off or flip them the bird or something, or I'll speed around them very fast so that they know that they made me upset, right? And I think that that happens in a lot of relationships too. We tend to funnel things through this idea that we need to get bad emotions away. If I'm feeling something bad, I need to get it to go away. And if what we're doing is finding external sources for those emotions, we don't have any problem pushing someone away. We have no problem threatening someone away. We have no problem trying to get whatever the external thing that's happening to stop at any means necessary, right?
mm, mm,
So again, when all of this behavior is seen through this lens of limitation, essentially, right? What men are limited to be able to do. Not only does that affect the way that people view us, but it also affects our self-image. So if I can only approach relationships with a few emotions under my belt, I've felt maybe grief if I've lost somebody, right? I've felt maybe a lot of anger, likely,
mm,
and again, frustration also has to do with the expectations that we're setting for other people, right? So if you and I are in a conversation, or if we're doing something together, and I have expectations for you, and you don't meet them, I get to get let off the hook for any other thing that I've done. There's no accountability there because you didn't meet the expectations I set for you, which were correct, right? Like you were supposed to meet those expectations, and now I'm just frustrated because you didn't meet them, right? That's much easier than me being um, open to thinking about like, were those expectations realistic? Where did they come from? Why did I set them? What did it mean? Did I think that you not meeting them meant that you didn't care? Right? Do I now feel hurt because I don't feel like a priority? Right? If I can't approach failings of others with that type of lens, I also can't do it for myself.
Mm.
Right? So if I've set an expectation for you and you not meeting it means that you're bad or wrong or something um, you know, bad about you, I also have that expectation for myself, right? If I can't meet an expectation someone has set for me, which there may be a lot, I think masculinity includes a lot of these really weird expectations about perfection and power and control. So all of a sudden, if I can't meet those, then now I have all of these statements about myself that, again, I used the word accountability earlier. I think people often confuse accountability with internalizing. So um, men will screw up or they'll do something bad, and then they'll just feel really bad about themselves, and that somehow is viewed as accountability, maybe through their eyes. Maybe because shame was used as an accountability tool throughout their lives, right?
Mm.
So if you did something wrong, you were then rightly shamed, and you were supposed to go to your room and feel bad about yourself, right? So um, because again, when we talk about the tools that people have for accountability, if shame is the tool you have for accountability, it's a really bad one. It's not a very effective tool at all. It's not a very effective motivator. It's not a real, um, you know, consistent tool for um, getting accountability out of somebody. Because if all I ever feel is shame when I screw up, why would I want to keep trying the thing that I was screwing up? Right? Clearly, I'm not capable, or clearly, this is the only way I can do it, or I'm broken, or something like that. Right? So if all of those things are the thoughts that we have related to emotions, hey, we're going to feel really scared of emotions. We're
Mm.
just not going to want to feel them. So we're going to push them away all the time. When people approach us with their emotions, we're going to be like, I don't want any part of that. Right?
Mm.
I want you to keep that to yourself. I'm going to keep my life very simple. There's this I think kind of trope in the U.S. about men having simple tastes,
Mm.
and mowing the lawn and having a beer afterwards or something like that is like a man's dream or whatever. There are tropes like that all over in Western culture, I think, and I think that again is sort of just a symbol of the this yearning for simplicity for men, and this like dream of decomplex, making things less complex in their social relationships and stuff like that. Again, if we boil things down to these stereotypes where women are emotional and men are logical, um, what we call that in therapy is intellectualizing, right? If
Mm.
we're constantly just looking for ways to think our way out of emotions, we're intellectualizing them in order to get them to go away. And emotions make things more complex because they don't have a solution, right? So if I'm just feeling sad, I can't necessarily just not feel sad. But if I push it away, then guess what? I don't have to feel sad because I pushed it away in theory.
Mm.
So I think that is kind of a start, right? So if we're afraid to feel emotions, which is what we've been taught to feel about emotions,
Mm.
there's no safe way for us to approach them. And if they become overwhelming, um, one of the ways that we can avoid them is through addiction. That's a very popular avoidance tactic. Another way is through again, there's these pop psych ways of describing it as emotional unavailability. So he's emotionally unavailable. Um, and there's other like hobbies and distractions that we can use that focus on things being fixable, right? Um, so emotional awareness is part of it. In order to have emotional awareness, you kind of have to be willing to feel emotions, which, like I said, we haven't given people good reasons to feel like they're capable of feeling emotions and not hurt somebody or not feel bad forever or have aspects of their masculinity questioned. Right? If we're crying in front of people all the time, how could you be manly if you were doing that? People might, view our vulnerability as weakness and use it against us, God forbid, right? Like there are all these dangers to feeling things. simply. Especially, if we're punished for it once, punished in the operational conditioning sense, right? If we feel something and somebody doesn't respond the way that we hoped and it hurts a lot, all of a sudden the volume and the risk associated with those emotions goes up a lot, right? As opposed to this out that we have that I mentioned earlier, which is boys will be boys, right? So they oh that's just I this has happened in my life a few times where people will um, kind of make some space for a person based on the ways that they've reacted to stuff in the past, right? So if it, let's say, let's call someone Jim, and if Jim tends to be sensitive around a certain topic, and then yell at you or call you names or belittle you or abuse you based on, when that topic comes up, sometimes we'll just make space for that person. Oh, geez, that's just Jim, right? How limiting, right? How brutal for Jim to be known as so incapable of being able to manage that emotion that people literally associate it with his person, right? So I think as we're talking about emotional accountability, emotional awareness, all of these skills around processing emotions, I just talked, I don't know, 10 minutes about all the reasons that we wouldn't have those skills or why those would be dangerous skills to have. Now, on the flip side, if men in particular can make safe spaces for men to experience emotions, all of a sudden we have a different ballgame.
Mm.
And I think I have talked about this in the past where um, I think even women see thoughtful men, empathetic men, I'm saying this broadly, as some kind of bonus to all the other things about masculinity that a man might have. But it's kind of, I think it's up to men to sort of realign that, right? To make emotional accountability and emotional awareness a part of masculinity as opposed to something that opposes masculinity, right? Um, I think that's kind of one of the keys is being willing to create spaces for other men to feel these things, and that kind of opposes the way that we were raised,
Mm.
right? So again, like I said, my it's not like in my family, my dad made a lot of space for us to process emotions, and nobody on all the sports teams I was on throughout the years, we never had a powwow to talk about each other's, or sorry, a meeting to talk about each other's um, feelings or make space for how we were feeling less than or anything like that. It was all this version of masculinity that was based on power and control.
Do you see that changing, Nathan? Do you see that nowadays there are groups, certainly in the UK, we have things called like Andy's Man Club, we have the Mankind Project, where there are groups of men and groups of women who meet and they share and they talk. Do you
Mm-hmm.
have that? Are you seeing that more in the US now? That certainly sports groups. I mean, one of my coaches I work with, he is connected to a lot of sports teams,
Mm-hmm.
and I know he brings a lot of emotional intelligence into that. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm presuming it is starting to happen. Is that what you're
Mm-hmm.
seeing?
I think starting is a really good way to describe it.
Okay.
I don't know that it's caught on, particularly, and I think it's going to be harder with older generations, just because I think everything it changes hard for everyone, and
Mhm.
um, an indictment on your version of masculinity. I don't know. I think we've seen lots of examples of that being a hard thing for people to hear, right? I think there's lots of things very um, stark contrast between the way people react to that idea that masculinity is somehow flawed. Lots of people get very protective and there's probably a lot of good reasons for that psychologically. But to answer more specifically your question, I think yes, I think it is starting. And I think I think people are becoming more willing to view men as whole, as opposed to some um, kind of section of a person, right? That we only have a certain amount of ways that we can view the world. And I think there are more and more men who are becoming open to the range that we can achieve, both with each other and with women. I think the more some of this um, gets integrated into, you know, a place that's close to my heart, which is athletics. The athletes in the U.S., particularly male athletes in the U.S., are pedestalized. They're treated as, um, you know, gods almost, like our versions of gods. And the more those men are able to embody some of these ways of thinking about masculinity, it's fantastic. Um, it's not always possible. And I think that things definitely change with fame and notoriety as far as how you even experience the world. So I think, again, pedestalizing athletes already is part of a problem. But as, like you said, as more people find it valuable to impact the way that men are kind of taught how to be men, then yeah, I think, and yes, I also think younger generations are not clinging quite so tightly to any of the ideas that I was talking about before, that boys will be boys, or that there's some, um, need for men to be limited in their ability to like show up in relationships and stuff like that. I do think that's starting to change.
Thank you, Nate. Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. And I guess there's many ways I could segue here, but I'd love kind of following on that theme about boys, and you mentioned, and men, two emotions we're allowed is anger, frustration.
Hmm.
A lot of my audience have been to boarding school, and what happens in that environment is even anger and frustration are not allowed. Sadness is not
Hmm.
allowed. What do
Hmm.
you feel is, in your clinical work to think that if a boy is growing up or a girl who suddenly
Hmm.
has no allowance of any emotion whatsoever,
Hmm.
what do you think the impact might be on them? If they're in that institution and they are for 9 to 10 months a year from ages 7 or 8
Hmm.
through till 18,
Hmm.
what do you think might happen to them?
The first word that comes to mind that I think is a sensitive one for people, but is rings true for me, is abuse. So when if we think about ways that we can that people are often abused, it's kind of limiting their autonomy and limiting their development, and through a whole bunch of different means, whether that's physical abuse, whether that's emotional abuse. And I think this kind of fits pretty neatly into that emotional abuse category. And what it generally does for people is it affects the way that they experience the world, right? So if if I'm if I'm not allowed or even able to make space for some of these emotions now as a child, when I'm learning how to interact with my peers, when I'm learning how to respond to authority, when I'm learning the rules of engagement, essentially, right? If those rules don't include even a place for anger, we haven't erased anger. It's not actually going anywhere, right? It'll still pop up. We just are now, um, we have to find ways to express it. And frustration, we have to find ways to express it. So let's say I'm frustrated with the way things are going, say at a boarding school or something like that. But there's no path for me to be heard. There's no path for it to be validated. There's no way for it to seem worthy. Um, I might have to find a different way to get my needs met because the needs are there regardless. I might act out in a certain way. I might act out eventually with my other relationships. I might actually, in my relationships, make it so that I am now in control of how my frustration is perceived, and it might always be perceived as a threat. Or I might completely deride all my needs and say that they're not useful or worthy. And I then maintain this cycle of abuse throughout my life, right? I seek out these relationships where someone's completely in control of me or has completely taken away my ability to speak for myself or something like that, right? So when there is no probably one path, obviously that happens when this kind of emotional abuse happens. but you can draw some dots as to how it can play out going forward. It might be that someone gets out of boarding school and immediately tries because they know it was wrong. They know that that was a terrible experience, and they seek out a space for them to finally feel heard and feel worthy. So that's also a possibility. But because of that sort of derailment of our emotional intelligence as a child, we're most plastic as a kid, right? So some of that will linger, and that informs the way our nervous system responds to things. So um, one of the most difficult um, trajectories for treatment in mental health circles is complex PTSD.
Mm.
Complex PTSD just means it happens more than once. There's not one thing, and it's kind of a um,
Judith
an
Herman
over and over.
talks about that, doesn't she? Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery, Complex PT.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So part of the reason is we can't heal over one experience. So there's lots of trauma interventions ask you to find one experience to sort of um, reduce your body's kind of natural um, nervous system responses to that thought or those triggers, right? So it's not actually possible with CPTSD. Um, and especially if there are different types of trauma, especially if there are different figures for the trauma, that kind of stuff. So it makes it really complicated because a lot of those messages start to get integrated. It starts to be messages about who we are and what we're worth, as opposed to what someone did to us and how we can heal from it. And that is work that's really hard to do. I'm sure I'm not saying I'm breaking any news for folks who are going through that. But it shows up over and over again in our relationships. So it can often show up in really toxic behaviors from us, from people who have gone through that sort of stuff, right? Because if our brains from then on threat detection mode, then we're going to perceive a lot of things that aren't threats as threats. We're gonna perceive emotional threats as threats, particularly, right? So if we have any experience of emotional threat from partners or friends or family members or something like that, we might do whatever it takes to kind of push them away or protect ourselves, and that might include hurting people. Um, so on the other hand, I do think one of the really sort of I think sticky places we find ourselves then is what is our job, right? Is it that we're damaged and broken forever and we can never show up in a relationship? And I don't think that's true.
Mhm.
But are we constantly supposed to be expecting people to make space for the ways in which we hurt them? That's a hard ask as well, right? So there's this kind of gray area or kind of both and where there's work to be done, right? And the work is not our partner's work. Our work is not our parents' work. Unfortunately, it's ours, and regardless how fair that is, I would argue pretty unfair. It ends up being going back to that accountability piece. It ends up being this challenge of letting go of this idea that you're broken, worthless, and shameful, and sort of embracing this idea that you're flawed and there's work to be done. Um, and and you are allowed to pursue showing up in relationships the way that you'd like to, as opposed to the way that it feels like you have to. And I think that that's a really hard thing to do. I say it like it's an easy thing to do, but I don't think that it is.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really
Mhm.
clear. It reminds me of Robert Bly a bit, him saying that often our wound can be our gold. That's often
Mm,
if we can work through that. I love what you say. It's like we have to do the work,
mhm,
and right, it's not our parents, it's not our partners, it's us who has to take responsibility.
mhm,
And I think,
mhm,
you've mentioned a few times when we fall over, as we will all fall over, it's not with shame,
mhm.
it's as we might have been taught as children, but it's like, okay, it's okay. I've messed up again. I love the Buddhist phrase. It might be Taoist or Buddhist, but for the 1,000th time, I learn 1 second quicker. And I love that because I was kept falling over, kept messing up, kept doing the same pattern. And it was like, oh, it's all right, Piers. I've still got another 998 to go.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I would love for us to maybe segue a little bit into how do we support men? How do we support
Mm,
men and boys really
hmm
to transition and to deal with more emotionality? Because I mean, I'll segue because I'm making a documentary at the moment about the impact of boarding school on our leaders and the world. Been
hmm
listening to a man from Harvard speak, and he says the old model of leadership is command and control. It's the old
hmm
model, came out of Ford. He says now we're moving to emotional intelligence.
hmm
And another lady I interviewed, spiritual intelligence. That's the new paradigm of leadership.
hmm
And
hmm
yeah, so I kind of see that things are changing.
hmm
I'd love for you to kind of talk a bit about that. What can we do as men and women?
I mean, that's a good question. I think sometimes it can feel a little daunting, to be up against such a, I mean, if you think about that movement, the leadership, what you were just talking about, emotional intelligence and leading through things other than power and control, domination, essentially. That's a hard, that's a hard thing to get over. It's been a part of, especially, I'll lump America in with European culture for hundreds of years, right? That's been thousands of years, right? So there's this lingering sort of human aspect to power and control that I think is really, really hard to get past. And I've thought about this a lot when it comes to men, manhood, masculinity, that kind of stuff, and how we show up in just society as leaders and who we make space for when, all that kind of stuff. And I think one conversation that's come up both in in the topic of white supremacy and patriarchy, all these things is um, asking someone to give up their power and control is actually a pretty tall task. And I'm certainly not making space for white supremacy or patriarchy, but the point being, there has to be some way for us to um, make it useful not to domineer. And I think that that is, again, it's a tall task, like you were just saying, like it's starting to move a little bit. But I also think that that starts through example, through treating. I'll talk about men in particular. They're treating men as though their domineering isn't the only way for them to gain social capital. I think social capital is this really surreptitious thing that uh, reinforces power and control. So if we think about social capital as like a CEO giving up their salary,
Mm.
right? You'd be hard pressed to find anyone who would, and we see it, right? And giving up their salary in order to pay their workers a better wage. I mean, it's few and far between, if ever. And you can think of social capital the same way. So I myself, I'll use my social capital as an example. I was an athlete. I'm a white cis heterosexual man. I'm healthy. Like I look healthy. My body looks healthy. I don't have to deal with fat phobia. So there's so much social capital that I have that if I were to give up any of that capital that I've been rewarded for, everyone who meets me sees all of those identities. All of a sudden, I might not get access to the resources that I have that make my life easier, make my life better, if I give up any of that social capital by, say, being an ally to marginalized groups, right? So if I'm show up with all those identities with a trans pride flag on my balcony, all of a sudden I've given some of that social capital up, right? So I think that is part of part of the dynamic that happens with us when we're trying to ask people to give up some of that social capital instead of creating social systems that make it necessary for them to give up some of the social capital that they're hoarding and help people come to the table. And I think that that is happening slowly, arduously, and over a long period of time, starting with, social justice work that started a long, long time ago in our country. But is still happening today. That some of the conversations that should have been over 70 years ago are still happening today. So it's obviously a slow trod to some of that kind of progress. But I think, again, if we're talking about specifically how we can make it more possible that men are going to view their social capital differently in terms of power and control and domineering, um, A, we have to make it safe for them to do so,
Mm.
right? So if there are aspects of masculinity that are almost never talked about. So homosexuality is not something that's ever included when we're talking about sort of Western masculinity. And in fact, it's often a marker for, um, again, giving up that social capital, right? So, there's a really good example that's happening right now with a very popular TV show, The Boys. Um, Everybody got very mad when one of the main male characters all of a sudden engaged in a he's bisexual in a homosexual relationship. And I think even though that you couldn't think of a show that was more gratuitous, right, and more right meeting a whole bunch of these
I
standards,
watched
right,
about 30 seconds and I'm like, oh my Lord, I
right,
won't be watching that again.
right. And so even though it met so many markers for all of these very valued aspects of even power, control, domineering, there's so many themes in that show. A male character, and there already were um, um, same-sex relationships in that show. But once it was a male-to-male same-sex relationship, all of a sudden the show got review bombed. Right? It's been a completely different reception to that um, uh, um, theme in the show. And I think it's just such a good example of how this stuff is happening on a social level as opposed to an individual level, because we can absolutely make space for men to talk about their feelings and talk about with some emotional depth, like what they've been through and what they're going through. As long as we respond favorably, and I don't mean on the individual level, but as a society, like jokes about men's homosexuality, right, belittling it, making it separate from manhood. I think that's a really good example of how that's going to be a less evolved version of manhood, no matter what. Right? There's just not going to be space for the full experience of men when we still refer to things we see on TV as closeted homosexuality or things that are homoerotic. And another place where that's come up, I think, is the different ways that men think about professional wrestling. Lots of folks in the queer community have talked about professional wrestling as like an awakening for them. Whereas there are other men who are not a part of the queer community who view professional wrestling as like the pinnacle of masculinity, right? Of these power and control, domineering parts of almost exaggerated parts of how we think about men. So I've always found that fascinating that there can be something that is so obviously in the gray area, right? So very clearly in this um, space between binaries of the male experience, and yet it can be so polarizing, right? So anyway, those are just some examples of yes, I'm happy to provide space for people to think about themselves with a little bit more depth, but there are also ways that men sort of need to step up too, where if there are people in their groups or in their circles who are even like belittling things like homosexual behavior or just like making fun of it. Ooh, because it's like no, that needs to be called out. And I think men in general need to do a better job of calling each other out, not through violence, not through threats, but just through communication, which again is not a tool that we're really given. We don't really. When I say I'm kind of asking men to do that, I also know that there's not a lot of examples or models of doing that without threats. Even if you see that happening in shows, movies, or media representations, it's not like, hey, Mike, I heard what you said earlier, and like that was really uncomfortable for me, and I didn't really like it. It's like, yo, shut your mouth, I'm gonna beat you up, or something like that, right? Like it's very threatening and violence oriented.
Mm.
And for, I guess I'll speak from my perspective. I've never been in a fight. I don't ever want, I don't hope to be. I don't hope to, have to defend myself in any way or threaten someone in any way. So I think that again is asking a lot. If we're going to ask men to be more vocal or call people out without violence, all of a sudden there aren't a lot of ways for us to do that, particularly in circles where violence is valued or power and control are valued in that way. So, um, and if we're resorting to those old ways of domineering, power and control, violence, all that kind of stuff, then the change that you're talking about actually doesn't get to happen. All we're doing is kind of threatening people into submission anyway, right? So the idea being, if I'm going to threaten you for being a bigot, you're probably just going to go get another bigot and try to beat me up for, like we're all of a sudden just having a turf war over what is masculinity. Whereas if we're talking about how we view behavior of men through a lens of boys will be boys or however we view it, we have to actually just start taking steps to just do things differently.
Mm.
And like you're talking about, having examples, modeling, having spaces, having safe places too, where it's not like you don't have to go way out on a limb, right, and risk your social capital, all of it, in order to do something that's effective in your relationships. I think again, can people do that, and can we encourage people to do that? Sure, of course. Like if someone's willing to you know, forfeit their social capital in order to make some of these changes, lovely. But I just think we're going to probably get better traction if we can just create spaces where they don't have to do that quite so often or to quite a high degree.
Mm. Are there spaces that in the US that I can put into the description? People can, I can put in a few from the UK
Hmm.
of spaces, certainly for men and women. Um,
I know. So my focus is a lot around like the treatment and mental health space. So I know that there are men's groups, and there are a few here in even the Denver area. So I think that's through a mental health lens. I think that's a good place to start, and frankly, I think that's a good place to start in general to reduce the sort of stigma that men have around mental health and therapy and stuff like that. If there's a good example that I have of how people view mental health. Like I have my PhD. I've been doing therapy for a long time, but my family still has some notions about mental health, and I um, made a suggestion to one of my family members about, maybe talk to a therapist. And this is a family member who loves me very much, and maybe talk to a therapist. And they literally told me to F off and stormed out of the room.
wow.
So there's still like this very sensitive area around
Mhm.
therapy, and of course people have had bad experience in therapy too. But if there are ways for us to challenge some of those notions, that's a good idea. And so I don't necessarily have a list of resources around men's groups in particular, but my guess is there are some offered in the area. But I also think showing up to our normal spaces with some vulnerability is great too. So if we're part of, if I'm in my experience, like I want to join a team, right? So if I join a rec league basketball team, again, making space for those men in my way might take some social capital, but there are little ways that we can start to integrate some of that closeness and intimacy. I also think, and this is a little bit off topic, so forgive me, but this is something I wanted to say earlier. If we think about the ways that women get to relate to each other versus the way men relate to each other, specifically with physical intimacy, we have a lot of room, and some of it doesn't come from a very good place, but we have a lot of room for physical intimacy between women. So when you're going through a hard time, I've seen, you know, women in my life hug each other, hold hands, like sit close on the couch, have their legs draped over each other, feel closeness in times when things are really hard. And there's a lot of research to support that. Like physical touch is really good for our brains and really good for our being social. So I haven't had that many opportunities to like hold hands with my buddies. I don't know about you, but like we don't often walk around holding hands.
I do actually.
Um,
Time to time, I have a few friends, if they're
that's
struggling
fantastic.
and I put my arm around. I think there's certain organizations that I'm part of, like the Mankind Project, that you do hug. I
Hmm.
don't often walk around holding hands, but there are
Hmm.
times when he's really struggling, a friend, or it's like, right,
Hmm.
hold your hand.
And
Um,
that access to intimacy with those men has to feel completely different than perhaps in the past when that wasn't available, right? Like that. So I think that level of intimacy with men is something that we also have to start asking for, even if it feels odd, and it probably will in certain circles. It will cost some. You'll have to spend some social capital on it. You'll have to spend some of your reputation on it to be like, I could really just use a hug, or it'd be great if I, put your arm around somebody or whatever, of course, and making sure people are comfortable with it and getting consent before touching them. But I think that there is some space for us to start integrating it with friendships that we have. Um, and that's a great way to model for our friends like what we need, right? And I think that's more what say like therapy might encourage us to do. If someone was in therapy with me, it would be like, well, what if we challenged you to ask for what you needed or pursue what you needed in a way that was really vulnerable for you? What would, there's a lot of fear associated with that. What may happen? What are you risking? But as far as having access to some of those groups, my guess is there are some just about everywhere, because you're right. This is something that's becoming
mm,
more and more urgent and more popular for men to even seek out, not just offer, but there are more and more men seeking this type of programming out for sure.
thank you. Thank you. Great. Well, I'll put some resources into the description so people can go. And if not, they don't see anything, mental health,
Mhm.
find local groups. Um, so thank you. Thank you. So we've been talking about an hour now. Is there a kind of something that you really wanted to share, Nate, that you've not spoken about yet, or something that you're like, oh,
Um, I think the intimacy piece was an important part of it, just because I do think that's a place where a lot of men are left wanting, and I know that, and most of the content that I've seen around learning more about manhood and masculinity, people talk about their fathers a lot. That is a theme that comes up all the time. I've almost not mentioned fathers since we started talking here.
mm,
So I would be remiss if we didn't at least touch on
yeah.
it.
Well, it was Father's Day here in the UK yesterday.
Yep, here too. So it is a little poignant as well to talk about, because with all holidays like that, I think they're treated as celebrations, and for many people, they are so conflicted and so mixed. And for some people, that is traumatic. I had a bad relationship with my father, and people ask me if I called my father today. Like that just doesn't leave a lot of space for people who struggle with fatherhood relationships. And I think um, we looked at that relationship because of um, the actually, I was listening to a book on tape. I don't know how familiar you are with the work of Bell Hooks. She writes on
One of my
love.
male friends actually uh, gave it to me for my birthday last year. I haven't read
Which
it.
book?
It's about
Is it
men.
about love? Or is it about men? Okay, so that's the book I was. Yeah, I forget the title of it. Let me find it really quick here on Spotify so that people are aware and can seek it out. Because I think, again, we talk about learning about masculinity from men, which is great and useful, I think, in a lot of circumstances. But Belle is a writer specifically focused on love, and her book about love, I think, is another really good one to read. But this one's called "The Will to Change: Men, Masculinity, and Love." And it's just, I'm a couple of chapters in, and I just love the way that she writes about stuff, first of all. But I think it's also fantastic to get um, a woman's perspective on her um, relationships with men and masculinity, and how she views masculinity, and how she's seen it affect the men in her life. particularly with her relationship with her father as well. But I think she talks a little bit about how valuable um, a father's love is compared to a mother's love is, and again, she talks about it from a scarcity model. So we've made father's love very valuable because of how scarce it is, and how um, like I talked about earlier, like there are aspects of masculinity that are paramount pillars of masculinity, and then like the man, he's a good dad is something we add on top of it for some reason. Like that has always been really confusing to me. Um, so not getting over, healing from these relationships with our fathers where um, there wasn't a lot of emotional intimacy allowed, not even just offered, but allowed. Maybe even creating some expectation that we should be tough or resilient in a way that doesn't include emotions, or they're preparing you for some hard life that exists, that they also experienced, right? So I think there are a lot of messages we get from our fathers that create some conflict, right? So not just that, like, well, dad didn't love me. It's like, well, that's a complicated answer. I think, I think there are ways that we're taught love, and this is another reason why I think reading it through the lens of Bell Hooks is really important, because her whole kind of lens is through love. So fathers don't have a really good grasp because they weren't taught how to love. That love is a verb, and that there are ways that we can actually do it as opposed to a feeling that like you love your children, of course. But there are ways for us to show love and to love our children that lots of fathers don't necessarily have access to. And to learn how to do that without having been shown it is actually really hard. It's not as simple as, have a child and love them. It's so what does that look like? How could I know I was loving my child? What would it mean for me to love them as opposed to show the love that my dad couldn't, or something like that? I think that's a really complicated and nuanced journey that includes both some hard feelings about dad, but also maybe some areas where if forgiveness is possible, that's something you can sort of explore and make space for. If not, healing from not being able to forgive your father is also a really important thing to do, right? So it's not that forgiveness needs to be forced, but also just kind of providing space for the grief that comes along with not forgiving your father or parental figure, I think is also really complicated and hard work to do. So anyway, yeah, I think I would have been hard pressed or remiss if I didn't at least talk about dads and their role in this a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I really agree with forgiving. I had a lot of hatred towards my father. He was a military officer and
Mm,
very angry, and didn't leave a lot of emotional space for me.
mm,
And certainly I found that very healing, just letting go of my anger towards him and learning to love him again, because essentially I'm learning to love that aspect of me. So
mm,
and I didn't realize that at the time, but it was
mhm.
all about him. But actually I was hating that part of me. So I found it very healing being able to see my father love him, and imagine he died 30 years ago nearly. No,
Wow.
20 years ago, 20 years ago. Um, so being able just to imagine holding him, that's a practice I do each day. I find it
Mm,
really, really lovely. Um, so I so agree with forgiving our fathers and mothers. Uh,
yeah. Belle also talks about the experience. I can't remember if it was her experience or somebody that she knew, or a book she was quoting about a woman whose father passed away, and she sort of like held him as he died. And her reflecting on this idea that that was the first sort of access she had to her father's body throughout her whole life, as far as, being close to him and feeling his body. So it was this very conflicting experience for her. And I think that's another, you know, place where it's hard to learn intimacy when, like, especially male to male intimacy, without a place where it was taught, especially appropriately. So obviously, there's lots of men who go through sexual abuse, and having to relearn appropriate male to male intimacy is a huge barrier for us, right? So it seems like there's this binary between, this was a healthy and good experience for me. It was no experience for me, or it was this awful, horrible, like never gonna touch that experience ever again. So I think again what you're sort of talking about, thinking about what it would be like to hold him again or be close to him, I think is such a powerful image because of just that space we're never allowed for, again, that physical intimacy that I was talking about earlier. That feels so loaded for so much of our lives. Like any contact with men feels kind of loaded and needs to happen in these very discrete categories. So I think, yeah, um, that was great. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. How do people find out and where do people go to find out more about your work, Nate?
So right now, I am mostly just offering clinical services. So they can go to, I work for a practice here in Denver called southpsychology.com, or South Psychology. The website is southpsychology.com. They can always email me as well if they have, want to talk more or have any other ideas for ways that, they'd like to help me engage in some of this stuff. Again, it's just my email is just nathan.baumann@baumannpsychology.com. Happy to talk about health psychology, men's psychology, all of it. I also just love having conversations like this. So there are not as many opportunities as there used to be as an academic to get involved in conversations like this. So this was great. I appreciate it.
Well, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for your time and yeah, your deep thought about this. It's great to have this conversation. So thank you. Okay, take
Thank you.
care.
Mhm.